title of the topic is the end-all be-all mix-in. Well, what the heck's a mix-in? So I'll back up a little bit. Basically, there's two flavors of CSS preprocessing out there. And what a preprocessor is just it's another level of functionality built on top of CSS. The output is still CSS, but the preprocessor lets you actually use it like a real programming language. The two out there that you might have heard of, Sass is one that we're going to talk about tonight, and then Less is the other one. And I actually didn't know before this what the difference was, but apparently Less is actually based in JavaScript. And it's really good for doing real-time authoring. You can write in Less and let the JS file actually figure the rest out. And that's interesting, but for us, it's not really what we wanted to do and wanted to use it for. So a long time ago, someone decided that we were going to go with Sass, and luckily, I think that decision still makes sense. Why I really like Sass right now is because of another program called Compass. CompassStyle.org. They are a library of pre-built mix-ins and functionality based on Sass and built on top of. So it's like this nice bundle you can download and use that's got a lot of the common things you might be using already built right into it. It's great for people just starting out. It's got a lot of functionality that you don't have to rewrite yourself. And then finally, I wanted to clear up something else that I wasn't really clear about. But first you want to choose if you need Sass or Less. Then you want to see if there's a library out there, some sort of helper library that you want to use. Compass is the one we use, but there's others. One of them is called Bourbon, which I really like just because of the name. But there's two different styles as well of how to write. So there's the Sass style, which is also confusing because it's not the same as Sass itself. Sass style is indented. You'll notice it kind of looks like CSS, but there's no curly braces, there's no semicolons. We felt like that was sort of like learning another syntax. We didn't want to do that. So luckily there's also this SCSS style, which looks a lot more like CSS. It's valid CSS3, more or less, and it's just got functions built in. So you'll see here there's variables, and there's like a little function like that darken function, which is also a nice little fun thing. And in both of these, you can do math right in there as well. But SCSS to us, which is what I'll be talking about for the rest of the talk, it just looks more comfortable. So for a lot of people starting to author this way, it's just a lower threshold for them to get up and running. And then finally, what does this all really mean? Well, these are two fairly simple examples of a function in SCSS or Sass and a mix-in. And the difference is slight, but a function basically spits out one value, while a mix-in will spit out entire sets of rules. So we created a function here that converts pixels to EMs. And it's really useful for thinking in pixels, but you want your CSS to be EMs. And what this is doing is, this variable is required, but this variable is has a default value to it. So if it's not present, you don't need to put it in there. And it just does some math. It just divides things and gives you an EM value. So if you don't want to think in EMs, you don't have to. And then down here, like in a sample project, maybe you've got a bunch of objects that need a drop shadow, but you want that drop shadow to be controlled from one place. So if you want to change the offset or change the blur, you can do that once and be done. That's an example of a mix-in. That's just one rule. Typically, they might have more than that, but it could easily be this, where you've set your defaults right away, and you can control that style wherever you apply it. So that's a really high-level view of what Sass is. And how it can work and how it might work for you. All right, so to start here, so what I'm talking about is kind of a revelation that I came to only a couple weeks ago. There's a bunch of people that we've been following. Sparkbox is a company down in Pittsburgh that's been doing some interesting things. And Chris Coyler over at CSS Tricks also is a great resource. Both of them have been trying to come up with a workflow with SAS, this powerful new tool that makes authoring responsively make a lot more sense. And this is all new to me. I've been only doing responsive design for about 2 years, which is about as long as I've been doing SAS. So it's been a learning curve and a journey to get here. What I thought I might do is walk through some of the things that we have been doing that were okay but not great, and why we came to the most recent workflow at the end of all this. So about a year ago, when like I said, responsive design was fresh on my mind and SAS was pretty new, I was using the same workflow that I had been using for a while, but just making my style sheets more programmatic. And what that consisted of is a mobile-first style sheet, and then what I called large screen, for lack of a better term, with a media query right in there. And that pretty apparently sent one style sheet to small browsers and an additional one to larger ones. Old IE was, old IE, so we had to do something else for them to make sure that they saw this, because once it saw that, it said, I don't know what to do with that, and just skipped it. But that was the basic workflow. And what that meant was you had all of your mobile first, no floats typically, in one style sheet, and then your actual layout in another. It worked okay, but it was sort of a backwards way to think about things. Because of this IE ridiculousness, it was getting the same style sheet. I didn't want to author more than one. But that meant that I had to have, in large screen, a bunch of styles for the 960 layout without a media query around them so that IE8 could read it. And then I reset that and kind of broke it back down again for like medium-sized screens. So when you were reading or looking through the actual large screen.css, things were sort of backwards. You had one layout, you had the biggest layout first, and then with media queries, you broke it back down again for tablets or for larger phones. So it worked okay, but it just wasn't really as efficient as it could be. Plus, we thought this was really cool in that small mobile devices wouldn't download it, but typically they do. So now that's 2 HTTP requests that are, and where one is basically unnecessary. After that, and after learning more about how mixins could be applied, we ended up moving in this direction, which is just half of the equation. So bear with me here. Still, we had the mobile first style sheet. Then we had what I called a media query style sheet, where everything had a media query around it. And we did some fancy things so that we didn't serve that to assistive devices. It's a nice idea, but it was actually very hard to test, and I'm not sure how well it worked for those devices. And the idea basically was that I had one layout.scss file. That's where I did all my floating and fun media query stuff. And two different files. One in mq.scss, I would wrap those mixins that I set up inside a media query. And in no MQ for IE8 and older, I just wouldn't. So at least I was authoring once and then deciding which parts were used where and either putting them inside a media query or not. This was still a little brittle. This was still like not ideal. You still had one set of styles in one style sheet and one set of styles in another. Further now, it was like kind of 4 different style sheets really that you were trying to manage and trying to figure out, well, do I want breakpoint small to be sent to IE8? Does it need those styles? How is that really structured? So again, it wasn't as efficient as it could be. I was frustrated, and a lot of other people were having the same problem. Sparkbox and Chris Coyer and others were trying to figure out, all right, what's the better way? Through a lot of different discussions, we came to something like this. And because I used the markup as an example, I'll start there. So this is messy, but essentially what I'm doing is I'm sending one style sheet to anything that's a quote-unquote modern browser. and one style sheet to those that are not. The nice thing here is that either way, they're only getting one HTTP request. Everything's all together in one place. And it's a little bit more straightforward when you look at it that way. What that's doing, I'll get into a little bit further here. With this kind of example markup, you know, say you have this typical container, maybe I'm setting up what my columns are and then 2 columns inside of that. What I can do now is set that container with Sass. Because Sass is nested, I can put 2 mixins right inside of that and say in one place, for this breakpoint, these are the rules. For that breakpoint, those are the rules. All together. So you can see how it follows from here what the structure is. You got your default columns, that second wrapper there. Inside that, column will float, and then I can change my widths as needed. What this Mixin will spit out for the media queries, it will spit something out actually inside media queries, as you would expect. It takes those rules, breaks them out, and makes them make a little bit more sense and nests them accordingly. And the magic really is that for browsers that don't understand any of that stuff, this is what you get. So you can actually specify which rules they get and which ones they don't. Now, this is all abstract until you probably see what the Mixin is actually doing. But essentially, it's a wrapper that puts that media query around it and then decides, am I actually going to output this or not? You'll notice here, serve to media query is set to false. So these rules don't apply when I don't need it. So now I'll get right into the Mixin. Magic TM. It's long, but you can kind of get a sense of what's going on here. Now I'm going to walk through all of it a little bit line by line so you can see what's going on. But again, you can see how Sass now is much more of a programmatic language. Like this looks and feels a lot like a PHP function. And that's kind of how it works. So what's going on is there's this content directive that Sass has, which basically says you can do all this stuff around the content that I've supplied to the Mixin, but then you don't need to do anything inside of that. So everything I write inside my include, my Mixin gets put into those places when it's appropriate. There's this global variable that I set first, which will make a little bit more sense later as well, to true, and I check right here if it's true or not. If it is true, then I'm going to do all this fun stuff with media queries, and if it's not, I'm just going to spit the content out directly. Then, because I wanted to make things as complicated as possible, I wanted this one media query to be able to do min widths and min or max heights. So I'm setting direction to width by default, but if I set height to true in my definition here, it'll change that and it'll spit out a different kind of direction. And finally, we're doing some simple if-else statements to say, well, is there a min present? Great, spit out a min width. Is there a max present? And either way, it's really just writing that media query for me in a more intelligent way and spitting out the content inside of that as it needs to. And then finally, like I said, if default is set to true, those rules will be output as well. But I could control it and tell this Mixin not to output anything at all. What that does is lets me structure things in a way that makes a little bit more sense. So now instead of layout, I've got something called project. Inside project, I can put all of my rules in there. I can break things down into partials if I want. I can put all my styles, mobile first as well as layout, all in the same place. Because remember, I can put my media queries right in any of my container blocks. I can define my header, put my media queries right there, put my mobile first things right there, and now it's all in one place. What the media query.scss file does, the one that actually gets spit out, it simply imports project and it runs it, and it lets the media query Mixin do its magic. What no media query does, remember that variable that sat outside? I just set it now globally to false. So now it's going to run through the same code, but now that that variable is false, certain rules are not going to get spit out at all, and no media queries will be spit out either. So the results of the same code base will just have a different application. Boom. So, that's not enough. I wanted to show a little bit about what my project looks like. Because now SAS is allowing me to get more and more anal. What I've actually started to do is break each project down into a partials folder, which contains functions and mixins that I've written over the past year or so that I like to reuse from project to project. So those typically don't change. And then everything inside the design folder is particular to that project. And because now each one of my sections is kind of long because it contains my mobile first as well as my regular styles, I've broken them up into partials here. And I generally break things up by the way the design lays out. So my header, my navigation, my content, my sidebar, my grid, any animation niceties I might have, any special mixins I've created for that project. I've organized them into separate files so that you can keep track of them a little bit better. And then further, I could put in some variables for the breakpoints I want to work with right here, or the nicest thing about it, in my mind, is that this kind of authoring style allows you to not be set with just one set of breakpoints. You don't need to think in 3 or 4 anymore, because they're a lot more modular and you can do authoring right here on that particular element. You can say, well, 25 isn't really where I want it to break. I want it to break it at 22.5 EMs and write it right in here. You don't necessarily need to manage things in large chunks anymore. You can manage them in the chunks that make the most sense for that particular element. And that's why I've started using this and start to really like the way it lets me use the kind of bigger container breakpoints that I've chosen, or be more granular about it as well. And I just love this unicorn. I was so happy to find this. Yeah, so, I'm sorry, I already did that. This gets back to why it's awesome. Everything is all in one place now, so it's a little bit easier to see what's going on with one particular element. You don't have to jump back and forth between multiple files to figure out, why is this layout not working the way I want it to work. Yeah, so it makes thinking about responsive design a little bit more modular. You can design in blocks, all in one file rather than splitting things off. It gives you control over when you want to output those rules inside media queries, when to output rules without, and then when not to output anything at all. So when you're dealing with older browsers and the cruff and the bloat and everything, you can really cut that no media query style sheet down quite a bit if you need to. And because it's still a separate file, put specific stuff right into that will only be parsed in that style sheet. And yeah, that coolest part is you can really get more granular with the breakpoints you want to manage, because they're all in one place, and you can kind of see things a little bit better in the code itself. And then I'm going to put this online, and you guys can download some of that code and play with it and see if it works for you guys. The biggest takeaway, I think, is that I learned how to put that Mixin together by looking at other people's stuff. I encourage anyone to look at that and tweak it as they see fit, make it work for them. And that's it for me. And then,
thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Can we get the unicorn back?